The anatomy of a perfect prank is simple: a brilliant setup, a clueless victim, and a glorious viral payoff. The 10 masterminds on our list today absolutely nailed the setup. The problem? They got the victim part catastrophically wrong and pointed the punchline squarely at themselves. Prepare to witness 10 perfect plans where the grand finale wasn't a viral video, but a very frantic 911 call. Do not use this video as an instruction manual. 1. Enter Julian, a 22-year-old aspiring digital cryptid whose biological imperative to accumulate arbitrary social media engagement thoroughly lobotomized his basic survival instincts. Julian had noticed a mild spike in algorithmic popularity for paranormal prank videos. And instead of taking a sensible route, he decided to fully commit to domestic automotive sabotage. His grand theatrical vision was to simulate a hyper-realistic Bigfoot sighting for unsuspecting midnight commuters. To achieve this, Julian heavily invested his meager savings into a custom-ordered, professional-grade, matte black ghillie suit explicitly designed to absorb every single photon of ambient light like a walking humanoid black hole. Now, let us take a vital detour into the unforgiving realm of commercial logistics. The average fully loaded 18-wheeler weighs roughly 80,000 pounds and requires the length of 2 entire football fields to halt from a cruising speed. Furthermore, commercial truckers are aggressively drilled on one singular, unbreakable golden rule. If a large, unidentifiable dark mass suddenly emerges from the tree line, under no circumstances do you swerve, because rolling the truck is a guaranteed catastrophe. You simply grip the wheel and let the grill guard do its unholy work. Ignorant to these fundamental laws of physics, Julian positioned his smartphone on a tripod, hit record, and vanished into the dense brush. For 2 hours, he waited in the freezing dampness, a dedicated artist suffering for his profoundly stupid craft. Finally, the heavy diesel rumble of an approaching Peterbilt echoed through the valley. As the piercing high beams sliced through the darkness, Julian's adrenaline spiked, entirely overriding his cerebral cortex. Timing his ambush with what he believed was cinematic perfection, Julian unleashed a guttural roar and violently hurled his dark, furry form directly into the center of the northbound lane. The exhausted trucker, deep into a 12-hour shift, did not logically process an internet prankster. His brain screamed "moose," and his professional training instantly engaged. He didn't even tap the brakes. He simply locked his elbows and plowed forward. Julian's grand viral debut lasted exactly 0.4 seconds before the reinforced chrome grille of the semi-truck struck him with the uncompromising kinetic fury of a localized meteor strike. He was converted from an aspiring TikTok celebrity into a tragic 2-dimensional cryptid-themed hood ornament. The authorities eventually recovered the pristine footage from the undisturbed tripod, which did technically immortalize Julian forever, though strictly as a classified, incredibly graphic training module for the Department of Transportation, demonstrating why nocturnal camouflage and moving traffic are a mathematically catastrophic combination. 2. Meet Kyle, an aspiring internet micro-celebrity whose desperate thirst for digital clout blinded him to the harsh realities of his living situation. Kyle shared an apartment with Marcus, a man whose resting heart rate was constantly elevated by a steady diet of true crime documentaries and an intense dedication to personal security. Marcus wasn't just cautious. He kept upgraded deadbolts on every door and slept with a legally registered, fully loaded personal defense tool holstered to his nightstand, treating every unannounced noise as a potential siege. Any rational human would look at Marcus and conclude that this is the absolute last person on Earth you should ever try to startle. But Kyle, whose brain operated on a terrifying mixture of cheap energy drinks and main character syndrome, saw only an untapped goldmine for viral reaction content. His masterpiece of a plan was to stage a terrifying, hyper-realistic home invasion at 3 in the morning, a time when human cognitive function is universally replaced by raw survival instincts. To ensure maximum psychological damage, Kyle went all out. He purchased a menacing black balaclava, strapped on a fake tactical vest, and procured a high-end airsoft rifle, taking the extra disastrous step of meticulously painting over the legally mandated bright orange safety tip with matte black spray paint. At precisely 3:15, Kyle set his smartphone on a tripod in the dark hallway, pressed record to capture his ascent to stardom, and crept toward Marcus's bedroom. A quick breakdown of human physiology under extreme duress. When violently ripped from deep sleep, the brain does not stop to analyze comedic timing or look for hidden prank cameras. It simply floods the nervous system with adrenaline and flips a glowing switch labeled fight or flight. Kyle bypassed the doorknob entirely, opting to deliver a spectacular front kick that instantly shattered the wooden doorframe. As he leaped into the pitch-black room, leveling his modified, realistic-looking plastic weapon and screaming aggressive obscenities, Marcus's heavily conditioned muscle memory took the wheel. The terrified roommate didn't scream, didn't ask questions, and certainly didn't wait to see if this heavily armed intruder was doing it for the views. Operating on pure self-preservation, Marcus rolled over, drew his defensive tool, and immediately neutralized the perceived threat, instantly ending the simulation. The deafening roar of the device instantly concluded the prank, permanently canceling Kyle's subscriber drive and violently demonstrating why you should never bring a plastic toy to a high-stakes standoff. When authorities reviewed the high-definition footage salvaged from the tripod, they didn't file criminal charges. They logged the video as a textbook example of a justified defensive reaction. Kyle's masterpiece did technically go viral within the county prosecutor's office, serving as a grim instructional video on how crossing the line between a harmless joke and a simulated extreme break-in is a remarkably efficient way to accidentally delete yourself from the census. 3. Have you ever looked at a perfectly serene summer afternoon, surrounded by friends relaxing on a boat, and thought to yourself, you know what this idyllic scenario really needs? A heavy dose of localized nautical chaos. That was the exact operating philosophy of Tyler, an amateur prop maker whose desperate need for attention routinely overpowered his basic understanding of aquatic physics. It was a holiday weekend on a notoriously murky, densely vegetated artificial reservoir, and Tyler had secretly spent weeks crafting his magnum opus in his garage. He hadn't just made a little foam fin, he constructed a massive, rigid, hyper-realistic fiberglass dorsal fin, modeled explicitly after a great white, and mounted it onto a complex array of surplus military nylon webbing designed to strap tightly across his chest and back. If we consult the fundamental laws of hydrodynamics, strapping a large, unyielding curved piece of solid plastic directly to your spine obliterates your natural center of buoyancy, effectively transforming your torso into a clumsy human-sized grappling hook. But Tyler wasn't concerned with fluid dynamics. He was focused on the cinematic reveal. While his friends were distracted at the front of their rented pontoon boat, arguing over a Bluetooth speaker, our aspiring director quietly slipped off the rear platform into the opaque water. His flawed strategy was to dive into the shadowy depths, swim underneath the hull, and dramatically breach the surface next to their floating inner tubes. What Tyler completely failed to account for was that this specific reservoir was infamous for its aggressively dense, almost jungle-like forests of invasive water weeds and thick, submerged timber. As he kicked vigorously toward the muddy bottom to ensure a stealthy approach, the rigid fiberglass fin protruding from his back acted exactly like an anchor plunging into a dragnet. It violently hooked underneath a massive, waterlogged tree branch suspended in a thick matrix of indestructible vegetation. The sudden stop panicked Tyler, who intuitively tried to thrash backward to free himself, a maneuver that only served to dig the curved fin deeper into the unyielding timber while twisting the intricate nylon webbing tightly around his ribcage. Because he had engineered the harness to be practically indestructible and secured the heavy metal buckles squarely between his shoulder blades where human arms physically cannot reach, he had inadvertently constructed an inescapable underwater straitjacket. While Tyler waged a silent, desperate, and ultimately losing battle against the ruthless flora of the lakebed, violently expelling the last of his oxygen just 4 feet below the surface, his friends topside were having a fantastic time. In a twist of brutally dark irony, the frantic splashing of his grand finale caused the very tip of the gray fiberglass fin to rhythmically bob above the waterline near the pontoon. His friends pointed, laughed uproariously, and filmed the little triangle on their phones, genuinely applauding Tyler for inventing such a clever, remote-controlled toy. They were blissfully unaware that they were actually giving a standing ovation to their buddy's entirely self-inflicted burial at sea, realizing only hours later that the punchline of the joke was a vacant seat on the ride home. 4. Picture the serene, snow-draped wilderness of a Midwestern January, the absolute last place you'd expect to find a weapon of mass envenomation. Enter Greg, a mid-level manager whose entire personality rested on being the office prankster. In reality, Greg was just the reason his company's HR department had a dedicated emergency hotline. His target for Monday morning was his supervisor, a man who possessed a highly vocal terror of anything with stingers. While hiking through the frozen woods, Greg stumbled upon nature's equivalent of an unexploded landmine, a massive, football-sized hornet's nest. Here is a quick lesson in survival. When the temperature drops, a hornet colony enters a state of deep diapause, waiting for warmth to reboot their rage-filled operating systems. But Greg, operating with the scientific literacy of a medieval peasant, looked at the frost-covered sphere and assumed cold equaled dead. He gleefully carried the dormant doom globe to his sedan, tossing it onto the back seat, giggling at the thought of rolling it onto his boss's desk. Because it was 10 degrees outside, Greg cranked his vehicle's climate control to a blistering 85 degrees, effectively turning his cabin into a rolling terrarium. As he merged onto the interstate, hitting 65 miles per hour and mentally rehearsing his victory, the artificial global warming began to work its dark magic. The sleeping colony, experiencing a rapid climate shift, concluded that May had officially arrived. The illusion of a harmless gag evaporated the exact second Greg heard a low, ominous vibration from the rear that sounded like a malfunctioning transformer. Before he could check his rearview mirror, the vanguard launched their assault. 300 profoundly disoriented and aggressively angry hornets erupted from the paper fortress, furious that their winter slumber was interrupted by a morning commute. The sedan instantly transformed into a localized tornado of venom and panic. Realizing he was trapped in a glass cage with a hostile swarm, Greg completely abandoned the concept of steering. In a frantic attempt to swat away the hornets currently attempting to colonize his forehead, he yanked his thick winter parka entirely over his head. Now completely blind, actively screaming, and heavily accelerating, Greg inadvertently turned his car into a 2-ton unguided missile. The vehicle drifted violently across 3 lanes, hopped the rumble strips, and decisively introduced its front grille to an unyielding concrete highway divider at 70 miles per hour. The sheer kinetic energy of the impact folded the engine block into the dashboard, permanently canceling Greg's comedy career. When first responders arrived expecting to use the jaws of life, they instead had to aggressively retreat and call animal control after opening the driver's door unleashed a biblical plague onto the freezing asphalt. The coroner cited blunt force trauma, but the truth was that Greg engineered his own demise by actively chauffeuring a literal swarm of furious hornets to his own high-speed conclusion. 5. The modern commercial construction site is essentially a heavily regulated playground of extreme hazards, making it the absolute worst possible environment for an intoxicated man seeking a cheap laugh. Consider the tragic case of Tommy, a structural ironworker who aggressively treated mandatory safety manuals not as life-saving guidelines, but as a series of personal, highly offensive dares. It was a humid Tuesday morning, roughly 5:30, and Tommy was arriving for his shift still heavily marinating in the questionable decisions and cheap tequila of a reckless Monday bender. His intended victim was the site foreman, Iron Mike, a famously humorless man who possessed zero tolerance for workplace shenanigans. Tommy's remarkably flawed blueprint for hilarity involved a massive multi-ton industrial cement mixer truck parked near the foundation forms. The colossal teardrop-shaped steel drum was completely empty, leaving only a damp, cavernous interior lined with massive corkscrew-shaped steel agitator blades. Tommy's brilliant strategy was to physically squeeze his hungover frame through the inspection hatch, crouch in the metal belly, and wait for Mike to walk by, at which point Tommy would burst forth like a demonic tradesman. To ensure stealth, Tommy enlisted the help of his coworker, Kevin, a man whose functional intellect was famously rivaled only by a mildly concussed golden retriever. Tommy's disastrous instruction was simple: Stand by the panel and jog the drum slowly for 1 second so my hatch is hidden. Tommy shimmied into the claustrophobic void, instantly regretting the smell of wet dust, but confidently sent a thumbs-up emoji to Kevin. Out by the control panel, Kevin stared blankly at the complex array of grease-covered levers like a dog trying to understand a magic trick. Instead of gently feathering the delicate rotation dial, Kevin confidently grasped the massive red lever, labeled High Velocity Agitate, and yanked it downward with his full body weight. Inside the drum, Tommy didn't even have time to register the roar of the diesel engine throttling up. In a fraction of a second, the steel stomach transitioned to a terrifying, blindingly fast rotational speed. He was entirely trapped by gravity, unable to orient himself or even scream, as the immense centrifugal force and the unforgiving steel fins subjected him to a rapid series of brutal, disorienting impacts. The relentless mechanism delivered a swift and overwhelming conclusion with the same merciless efficiency it normally reserved for dense gravel and wet concrete. By the time the foreman tackled a wildly panicking Kevin to kill the emergency switch, it was profoundly too late. The massive drum groaned to a halt, but Tommy had already met a tragically abrupt and crushing end, transforming a childish jump scare into a grim, highly publicized reason why heavy machinery control panels desperately need breathalyzer interlocks. 6. If gym mirrors could talk, they would have certainly warned a highly dedicated enthusiast named Beef, a man who treated every reflective surface as a personal audience and entirely neglected his cerebral development in favor of maximizing his bicep peaks. Beef frequented a notoriously rundown 24-hour fitness center that proudly ignored maintenance requests and viewed basic facility safety standards as mere suggestions. His target was his lifting partner, Chad, a man whose hyper-caffeinated pre-workout routine made him exceptionally jumpy. It was past midnight, the gym was devoid of staff, and the flickering lights cast a depressing gloom. Beef hatched an incredibly simple, remarkably foolish plan. He would channel his inner Jack-in-the-Box, terrifying Chad the exact moment he walked into the men's changing area. Beef selected his ambush location perfectly, a monolithic, incredibly heavy 6-foot-tall bank of vintage steel lockers against the back wall. What Beef's creatine-flooded brain entirely failed to analyze was the horrifying reality. This specific massive row of lockers was completely empty, notoriously top-heavy, and, most crucially, it lurched away from the wall it had merely been leaning against in one terrifying movement. It was essentially an 800-pound steel domino waiting for provocation. Beef violently contorted his muscular, 200-pound frame into the cramped, dark confines of locker number 42, ignoring the toxic scent of abandoned knee sleeves. He stood perfectly still, knees bent, shoulders wedged against the metal, listening for the squeak of Chad's shoes. After 10 agonizing minutes, he heard the footsteps. Waiting until Chad was exactly parallel to his metal trap, Beef didn't just push the latch. He aggressively coiled his legs and violently threw his entire body weight forward, slamming both palms against the door while roaring like a gorilla. The thin metal door burst open, but Sir Isaac Newton's unforgiving third law of motion instantly intervened. Because Beef had weaponized his kinetic energy from inside a freestanding, top-heavy box, the immense forward thrust violently shifted the structural fulcrum past the point of no return. The tower of steel didn't just lean, it completely detached from the wall in one terrifying movement. Beef experienced a horrifying sensation of weightlessness as he fell face-first out of the locker, unable to catch himself because his arms were still extended. He slammed into the concrete floor, and before he could draw a breath, the entire 800-pound structure crashed down with the roar of a localized earthquake. The sheer weight flattened him instantly against the concrete, permanently canceling his membership in a single fraction of a second. The facility's insurance claim was swiftly denied due to a clause explicitly citing willful destruction of property, leaving Beef's legacy as an undeniable testament to why you should absolutely never fight a heavy metal object that you haven't bothered to secure to the studs. 7. There is a terrifying psychological phenomenon known as a lack of object permanence, typically observed in literal infants who believe a toy ceases to exist the moment you throw a blanket over it. Tragically, our next visionary carried this cognitive failing well into his mid-20s. This brings us to Chase, a man whose dedication to orchestrating household chaos was matched only by his spectacularly abysmal short-term memory. Chase lived in a massive rental home featuring a notoriously steep, uncarpeted oak staircase that essentially functioned as a decorative indoor cliff. His ongoing prank war with his roommate had been escalating, and Chase decided to deploy a classic booby trap. His weapon of mass humiliation was a roll of industrial-strength, perfectly transparent packing tape. Chase meticulously stretched a wide, invisible band of this ultra-sticky polymer directly across the very top step of the treacherous wooden staircase, anchoring it firmly to the banisters at precisely ankle height. His brilliant master plan was to hide in his bedroom, call his roommate's phone, and eagerly listen to the satisfying, hollow thud of a human body tumbling down hardwood stairs. However, Chase possessed the attention span of a heavily caffeinated squirrel. While marveling at his own diabolical genius, a violently overriding stimulus entered the equation. The doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of a massive pizza he had ordered earlier. In a disastrous triumph of gluttony over situational awareness, the intoxicating aroma of processed cheese instantly wiped the memory of the invisible tripwire from Chase's limited frontal lobe. Operating purely on predatory hunger, Chase vaulted off his mattress and initiated a full-blown sprint down the hallway, entirely focused on reaching the front door. As he rounded the corner and launched his weight toward the top of the stairs, his leading shin made uncompromising contact with the taut, unyielding barrier of the packing tape. Traveling at a reckless, pizza-motivated velocity, the sudden restraint on his lower extremities instantaneously converted his forward momentum into an involuntary acrobatic maneuver. Chase's legs were violently halted, but his torso continued its rapid trajectory, launching him headfirst into the unforgiving airspace above the oak steps. He transformed into a human javelin, executing an ungraceful swan dive directly down the steep chasm. He bypassed the first 12 steps entirely, ultimately arresting his catastrophic descent by introducing his forehead directly to the solid edge of the heavy oak foyer table at the bottom landing. The sheer kinetic energy of the impact resulted in an instant, final connection with the furniture. When the confused delivery driver peered through the front door, he was treated to the silent tableau of a man who brilliantly engineered his own tragically abrupt finale, proving that if you lay a tripwire, you should probably write yourself a sticky note. 8. Basic physics dictates that human bone is a poor substitute for a commercial brake pad, a concept that completely bypassed the heavily diluted brain of a man named Derek, whose confidence vastly outweighed his competence. His canvas for disaster was a steep, winding, incredibly precarious residential driveway in the Hollywood Hills, and his prop was his best friend's pristine 2-ton luxury sedan. Derek's grand vision was the legendary ghost car prank. Creep into the driver's seat of the parked vehicle, shift into neutral, duck completely out of sight, and let the car slowly roll backward to create the illusion of a haunted automobile. What Derek completely failed to calculate was the driveway's aggressive incline and the terrifying compounding nature of momentum. He popped the gear shift into neutral, dropped to the floorboards, and giggled as the heavy steel chassis began its backwards descent. However, instead of casually drifting toward a manicured grassy swale, the heavy sedan rapidly caught the steep slope, aggressively accelerated, and violently veered off its intended path, angling directly toward a blind, heavily trafficked intersection at the bottom of the hill. Peeking over the dashboard, Derek suddenly realized his paranormal joke was rapidly evolving into a catastrophic vehicular disaster. Panic immediately flooded his nervous system, shutting down all rational thought. A sane person would have simply reached up, grabbed the steering wheel, and yanked the emergency brake. Instead, Derek threw open the driver's side door, stumbled onto the asphalt, and sprinted frantically down the slope to outpace the accelerating vehicle. In a misguided display of cinematic heroics, he threw himself directly into the path of the rolling, 4,000-pound mass of German engineering, planted his expensive sneakers on the pavement, and aggressively grabbed the rear bumper, genuinely believing he could bench press a moving automobile. This was an unforgiving lesson in Newtonian physics. The sheer mass of the vehicle didn't even register Derek's pathetic, fleshy resistance. His sneakers instantly lost traction, sweeping his legs out from underneath him, dragging his torso directly into the path of the rotating rear tires. The luxury sedan effortlessly rolled squarely over him with the uncompromising force of a steamroller, canceling his plans before lazily coasting to a gentle stop in a thicket of decorative bushes. His friend, walking out of the house moments later, was completely baffled to find his pristine car parked safely in the shrubbery, while the aspiring prankster was permanently converted into a highly cautionary, two-dimensional speed bump on the pavement. 9. Industrial-grade silicone lubricant is a chemical marvel specifically engineered to eliminate friction from heavy manufacturing machinery. It is, under absolutely no circumstances, meant to be poured across a kitchen floor by an aspiring viral filmmaker named Toby, whose obsession with manufacturing the perfect internet video turned his shared apartment into a disposable, lethally slick soundstage. His target was his unsuspecting roommate, and his chosen weapon was a gallon jug of industrial-grade silicone lubricant, a viscous synthetic compound specifically designed to entirely eliminate friction from heavy manufacturing machinery. Toby's masterpiece involved heavily coating the expensive, highly polished porcelain tiles of their modern kitchen floor, essentially creating an invisible, frictionless void right in front of the refrigerator. He meticulously painted the floor like a twisted Picasso, ensuring a devastatingly slick surface. However, Toby's critical flaw was his complete lack of spatial awareness regarding his own immediate environment. While slathering the floor with the friction deleter, he carelessly shuffled backward, thoroughly soaking the rubber soles of his own sneakers in the invisible slime. With the trap perfectly set, Toby needed to secure the optimal cinematic camera angle to capture his roommate's impending downfall. Deciding a high aerial shot was necessary, he dragged a notoriously wobbly wooden bar stool from the kitchen island and planted it right on the edge of the danger zone. Holding his smartphone, Toby carelessly stepped onto the bottom rung, forgetting his footwear was coated in a substance so slippery it could make a hockey puck jealous. The exact millisecond Toby attempted to shift his body weight upward to the seat, the lubricated soles of his sneakers catastrophically failed to establish any grip on the polished wooden rung. The resulting physical reaction was so violently abrupt, it defied the laws of animation. His feet shot out from underneath him at lightning speed, entirely detaching his body from the stool and launching him into a terrifying backward freefall. Because both hands were instinctively gripping his precious smartphone, he couldn't attempt to brace for impact. Toby fell backward in a stiff, horizontal plank, violently introducing the back of his unprotected skull directly to the unyielding, sharply beveled granite edge of the luxurious kitchen island countertop. The heavy thud of his skull hitting the granite was a catastrophic lights-out impact that should have ended it right there. But his own prank had one final cruel punchline. The industrial lubricant sent his now limp body sliding like a human hockey puck, delivering a brutal secondary impact against the reinforced steel base of the refrigerator that made absolutely certain his filmmaking career was permanently canceled. When his roommate returned home hours later, he didn't encounter a hilarious prank. He walked into a bizarrely pristine, highly lubricated accident scene, finding Toby lying motionless in a puddle of silicone. The floor was so aggressively slick that responding paramedics literally had to lay down a trail of bath towels just to safely reach the body without suffering the exact same disastrous fate. 10. Seth was a dedicated prankster who firmly believed that if a joke didn't incite raw, primal terror, it wasn't worth executing. It was late October, and he had invested heavily in an elaborate, hyper-realistic zombie costume consisting of an oversized canvas trench coat adorned with literally dozens of dangling nylon straps, metal buckles, and frayed ropes designed to look like a decaying straitjacket. His brilliantly stupid plan was to target his buddy, Mark, who owned a massive, heavily modified Jeep Wrangler sitting on 37-inch mud tires. The Jeep was parked at the far end of a dimly lit college parking lot, featuring a brutal series of aggressive concrete speed bumps. Seth's strategy was to commando crawl underneath the high clearance of the Jeep, lay perfectly still in the dripping oil, and violently grab Mark's ankle the exact moment he attempted to unlock the door. In the pitch blackness beneath the massive vehicle, Seth shimmied into position, utterly failing to realize that his elaborate, strappy costume was actively interacting with the mechanical underbelly. A thick canvas strap dangling from his waist wrapped itself flawlessly around the exposed rear drive shaft, while another nylon belt locked itself tightly around a rigid suspension bracket, effectively tethering Seth to the heavy machinery. A few minutes later, Mark casually strolled out to his vehicle, completely oblivious to the horrific monster violently attempting to untangle himself from the drivetrain. Seth realized his massive error and began to panic. But before he could shout a warning, Mark hopped into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and cranked the ignition. Mark, a notorious audiophile, immediately engaged his aftermarket sound system, aggressively blasting deafening bass-heavy dubstep that completely masked Seth's sudden, terrified screams from beneath the floorboards. Mark confidently threw the transmission into reverse and stomped on the gas pedal. The massive steel drive shaft instantly engaged and violently spun, rapidly winding the loose canvas strap like a terrifying mechanical winch. In a brutal fraction of a second, the spinning shaft viciously yanked Seth's torso upward, violently pinning him against the hot exhaust and instantly transforming his elaborate costume into an inescapable industrial knot. Mark, completely deaf to the localized action movie unfolding beneath his seats, threw the Jeep into drive and aggressively accelerated toward the exit, towing his unintended passenger relentlessly along for the ride. The final blow arrived when Mark aggressively launched the massive vehicle over the first of the three brutal, unyielding concrete speed bumps at 20 miles per hour, subjecting Seth's trapped body to a catastrophic kinetic impact that permanently deleted him from the gene pool. Mark was left confused by the sudden drag affecting his gas mileage, only later discovering his friend had become a permanent, tragic addition to the undercarriage. So the Darwin Award's handbook just got 10 new chapters. Alright, confession time. What is the single dumbest, most catastrophic prank idea you've ever heard someone seriously suggest? Drop it in the comments. Let's create a public museum of bad decisions so we can learn from them. Smash the like button if your survival instincts are still tingling, and subscribe for more reasons to stay inside.